We're going to pick up where we left off in class. We had been discussing the nature-nurture debate and the people relevant to it. Again, Aristotle and Plato, the people that were the origins of psychology are vast and varied. We're looking at two key schools that really informed psychology early on, philosophy and physiology. While it's not going to be technically scientific psychology at this point, some of the people that influence it would be people like Darwin and Pavlov. Neither psychologists, but both take elements of what they have discovered and we bring it into psychology. With Darwin, there's the development of evolutionary psychology, the idea that there is some sort of kinship between humans and animals, that we can look at and study animals and have them tell us something. Wundt worked to make psychology an independent discipline, like I stated before, and really his entire focus was to make psychology measurable, to make it something that we could prove, that we could experiment upon, that we could investigate. The primary focus was consciousness, and so the earliest definition of psychology was the study of the conscious experience. When you became aware of something, when you looked at something, when you noticed something, what was going around and how you interpreted it, all of your kind of conscious efforts, what you thought about an immediate reaction to something. So the very early definition is the study of the conscious self. Later, as we start to evolve through different disciplines, it will become the scientific study of behavior and mental processes, consciousness being part of the mental processes. So just understand that this really early definition doesn't bring into account behaviorism, doesn't bring into account other cognitive processes. This was literally just the scientific study of what it is to be conscious. And again, here's a quote from one saying essentially that if you can't measure something, if you can't put it into numbers, it really means nothing. It only means something when you can quantify, when you can actually express it. Psychology's primary focus was the consciousness. And again, that's an early definition. You're going to have a question on your first test that's going to ask you about the early definition of psychology. Be aware that the early definition is different than the modern one, which is psychology was concerned with consciousness. Now we're concerned about a whole much larger array of behaviors. Here's again your definition for the term introspection, and again, self-observation, self-report. This could be what you thought, what you felt, what you noticed. And again, Wundt would run these extensive experiments where he would have people literally just respond to when they perceived a flashing of light, or when they heard a ticking sound, or when they saw something. And he wanted them to report as quickly back about what they saw or when they perceived it. And again, this was psychology will move from Germany to here in the United States, and we'll look particularly at American psychology. G. Stanley Hall is going to be a student of Wundt. He's going to bring psychology, or at least this scientific approach to psychology, to the United States. It will be considered that he establishes America's first research laboratory at Johns Hopkins University in 1883. Now understand that the laboratory that was established in Leipzig, Germany by Wundt was in 1879. Another notable thing from G. Stanley Hall is that he launches the very first journal of psychology in the United States. Strangely enough, while that seems like a footnote, a scholarly journal is really important as establishing something as a science. We will go to research journals to look for any kind of basic or furthered information, and you'll hear me in class talk quite a bit about different bits of new research that come out constantly. These are validated and expressed through journals. So this first journal is kind of a launching point for the scientific component to psychology. And he's the driving force behind the establishment of the American Psychological Association, which is still operational today, has a whole list of different sub-organizations that you can join. You can join if you're a student, you can join if you're a teacher of the content, if you're a professor, or if you're an active psychologist. This organizational body starts to create the first school of psychology is going to be structuralism. Before we move Functionalism is going to come after structuralism, and as I told you before, the word structure meant what was it made from? Well, functionalism, how does it function? And functionalism is going to be the second school of psychology that's more concerned about what do we do with the conscious experience? What does it do for us? What is its purpose or its literal function? The person who does this or brings this focus to the United States is going to be William James. He's considered the father of American psychology. Now keep this very, very clear. That's not the most important thing about William James. Father of psychology is Wilhelm Wundt. William James is going to be known for a couple of different things. So here you go. He wrote the first comprehensive psychology textbook called The Principles of Psychology in 1890. It took him 12 years to write because it was somewhere around like, I don't know, 14,000 pages long. It was some ridiculously long book, and that's why it took him 12 years to write. It also took him 12 years to write because he kept changing his focus about what psychology should focus on. The function of your conscious experience, that's huge. It's a really broad kind of scope. He did practice scientific psychology. He did something as simple as this old held idea that as long as you tried to remember anything, it would strengthen your memory. And he was able to set up a very simple experiment that showed that sometimes just remembering nonsense doesn't actually strengthen your memory, it can actually diminish your memory. So again, definitely a scientific psychologist, wrote the very first textbook. Another point for James is that he felt that psychology should study the function of the conscious experience, again, the construction of functionalism, and he also coined the term stream of consciousness, which we'll hear again later when we're talking about Freud and Jung and personality theory. But literally, he felt that your conscious experience was very much like a video recording. It was constant, uninterrupted, this continually kind of holistic experience with no real kind of endpoint to it. He does call attention to Sigmund Freud, and while we're not in class and I don't have the time to get into my rant, Freud is not exactly my favorite psychologist, and here's why. Everybody knows who Freud is, and Freud is one of the most disproven theorists that we have. His theories are really good for the time period in which he constructed them, which would have been the late 1890s and the early 1900s, but they're not really based on anything but conjecture. And so there's a lot of flaws to it, but everyone knows the Oedipus complex, and everybody knows defense mechanisms, and everyone knows repression, and everyone knows. Another person that you should know is Mary Whiton Calkins. Now, she's going to be more of a footnote. You'll get like one question about her maybe on a test, but very rarely does she ever show up on an AP exam. She's notable because she is going to be the first woman to serve as the president of the American Psychological Association. She does graduate from Harvard. However, they refused to give her her PhD because she was a woman. They offered her a doctorate from Radcliffe, which was their sister school, and of course she refused because, I mean, she earned the PhD. The reason you're not going to hear a whole lot about women and minorities is because of the time or the historical period that this was going on. It was not that common that women would have been engaged in higher education. It would not have been the time where most minorities were engaged in higher education. So please keep that in mind, why most of this is going to be white males from kind of the upper class. The working, the poor, the minorities would have not had the same opportunity to higher education. Gestalt psychology. Gestalt's going to come after functionalism, and Gestalt means the whole. It's a German word, and Gestalt, the whole, means your whole perceptual experience. The room that you're sitting in right now, there's probably more going on than what you're paying attention to. If you're listening to your computer or your telephone or whatever it might be, you are focused on a narrow range of things in your environment, and there's probably outside noises, there's probably the feeling of your clothing, there's probably smells in the air. You may have just eaten something and there maybe be like the lingering taste of something in your mouth, but we don't pay. Then we get to psychoanalysis and Freud. Sigmund Freud is an Austrian physician who then later gets into psychology, and he creates the school of psychoanalysis or psychodynamic theory. And each of those terms are interchangeable. He's going to sit there and say that there is far more going on underneath the surface in our unconscious mind, and that those unconscious experiences very much fuel our conscious awareness. The word unconscious is a buzzword for psychoanalysis. If anything is happening at an unconscious level, literally you are unable to perceive it, you are unable to have awareness of it, it is below that kind of threshold. It's somehow repressed into your memory and you cannot. Most of his theory was written by observing patients. So people who are already suffering from something, or from observing his children when we get later into his theories about development. And he felt that all of these things usually were going to be issues that were resulting conflicts at what we'd call an unconscious level. So while not the greatest example, think about the fact that maybe you need to study for a test, but you also want to go hang out with your friends. You're consciously aware of that conflict. But let's say maybe you didn't have a conscious awareness and it was an internal conflict. Freud would sit there and say that a component of you called your id, your desire to have sex and to be aggressive and all of these primal urges, that you wants to go to the party. But then there's this part of you at the unconscious level called the superego. And the superego has internalized all the rules of a society. And it says, no, academics are far more important. That conflict would then result in you, your ego, which is the part that you're consciously aware of, going, I should probably study for a little bit and then I can go and enjoy myself at the party. That's what he's really kind of talking about. He's also the one that would sit there and say that all of the problems that happen in your life is due to poor parenting and bad, things that happened to you when you were a child. And again, unless it's really extreme, it's just probably not the cause. Psychoanalytic theory explains personality, motivation, mental disorders by focusing on, and here's that big word again, unconscious determinants of behavior. So again, all of those things, your personality, what makes you want to do stuff, even for him, his interpretation that mental illness was all due to these unconscious elements. I will tell you, he's wrong. We're usually very aware of what is motivating us. You're usually very aware of the components of our personality, and some of it's biological. And mental disorders, it's not going to be something that's unconscious. There's a whole host of reasons for why various mental illnesses. So he's controversial in psychology, but he is notable because of his public popularity. The other thing that you have to realize is that Freud was operating during the early 1900s, and so when he wrote most of his theory, he was operating off of what was considered scholarly sources, the Greek philosophers, medieval philosophers, people who had, written and were seen as great thinkers. And so today when we sit there and we go, philosophy is not a basis for knowledge, it's a way to think. Freud used them as the crux, which is why the Oedipus complex is actually written after the story of Oedipus Rex. Some other followers that we'll look at will be Carl Jung and Alfred Adler. You should know their names. This is one of those times that you want to memorize all three names. Jung, Adler, Freud, all psychoanalysis, all would talk about unconscious. Behaviorism is by far one of my favorite disciplines in psychology. And here you have John B. Watson. And behaviorism, again, is going to be this idea that psychology should only study what you can observe. This is a huge deviation from Freud. Freud looked at the unconscious. Behaviorists actually take a very different approach and say psychology can't look at what cannot be measured. It has to be purely scientific. It has to be brought into a laboratory. There has to be a pass-fail scenario. This has to be something that can have a true experiment attached to it. And so looking at this one, he would sit there and say, especially Watson would say, Freud was wrong. You may have an unconscious, but we can't measure it, and if it can't be measured, it can't be part of psychology. So psychology was supposed to be only what could John B. Watson is going to be the founder of behaviorism. Now, Ivan Pavlov, and many of you guys have heard of Pavlov or his salivating dogs, he comes way before Watson, but he is not the father or the founder of behaviorism. And again, Watson felt that for psychology to be a science, it had to get rid of things that couldn't be measured, like the unconscious, which was very theoretical, and it could only look. We'll talk about Broca, Ebbinghaus, and Prosser is a little less talked about. Paul Broca we'll talk about because he's going to be incredibly important when we start looking at the brain. And if you notice, he was operating between 1824 and 1880, and during the later part of that range, there was a really big war that happened here in the United States called the Civil War, and during that war there were a lot of head traumas. And head traumas allowed him to discover that there was a very specific area in the left frontal lobe of the brain that controls our ability to move our mouth. And so the more head traumas, the more likely it was that he was able to discover this very specific area. So this is before the age of brain scans. He was able to find that there was a specific location that allows you to move your mouth. We'll talk way more about Broca when we get into the anatomy of the brain. Hermann Ebbinghaus is going to be notable, and again very early on, but he's going to be one of the fundamental theorists that we talk about when we talk about memory. And again, he was someone who constructed this really cool thing called the forgetting curve and showed that if we don't repeat material, the material essentially starts to disappear. And so we'll talk about him later as well. Beverly Inez Prosser, again, this is one of those times where I will tell you we just don't spend much time because there are very limited representations, but she was the first African American female to receive a PhD in psychology, and because of that, and especially we're now going to look at the psychological approaches, and you're going to find that I am going to sound like I'm repeating myself because I gave you some of the important people. Now we're going to look at what their approaches are. Later, after we get through behavioral, we're going to have biological, and then right after that on the heels, we're going to have what's called the cognitive approach. Biological approach is going to have to do with psychosurgeries and neuroscience and literally looking at that big 3-pound lumpy jelly gray mushy mass that is your brain and all the chemicals that it pumps out, whether they're neurotransmitters or they're hormones from your endocrine system, whatever it might be. It's looking at the actual biology of the brain and how that underlies behavior. We'll look at Sperry, and Sperry is going to be notable because Roger Sperry is going to be one of the people who was involved in what's called a split brain procedure. Make a little sever through an area called the corpus callosum and split the brain into 2 independent working halves and see what happens. We'll also look at behavioral approach we talked about, and again that was in 1913 until the present, and that's going to be Watson, and again John B. Watson, B.F. Skinner, Ivan Pavlov. Other words that you should know that go with this: reward and punishment, observation, conditioning. Those are all very important terms that go with behavioral approach. So if you do something or you increase the behavior because you've been rewarded, that would be Skinner with positive reinforcement. If you do a behavior and you increase it because you get to avoid something you don't like, and the behavior increases, that's Skinner again, and that's negative reinforcement. If you decrease the behavior because something is added to it and the behavior goes down, that's a positive punishment. And if you decrease the behavior because something is taken away, that's a negative punishment. So when we're looking at this, Skinner looked at rewards and punishments. We're going to have another researcher, Bandura, looked at just by watching other people we can learn, and that's modeling. Watson was classical conditioning, and that's unconditioned stimuli and all these other things, and essentially it's all what we'd call associative learning. Cognitive approach, cognition means thought. Cogs are gears. So in my head, I always think about all the little gears that have to turn together to make everything work. Cognitive approach looks at how you problem solve, how your memory system works, how you rationalize and use logic, how you conceptualize things, all of your mental processes. So how you acquire, how you store, and how you process information. We'll look at Jean Piaget, and Piaget is going to look at the way that children's cognitive abilities change as they grow. We'll look at Noam Chomsky. He's going to look at specifically language acquisition and how we speak. Those two are the ones that I really want you guys to focus on. Humanistic approach. This one, while it is not as disproven as Freud, some people have a hard time attaching to because this one really is very philosophical as well. The humanistic approach happens in the 1950s, and it's a backlash to Freud and a backlash to the behaviorist. So humanists felt that, one, the unconscious motivations that were pushing us towards destructive behaviors or sexual desires, that was just way too demonizing for humans, and that we weren't just these two small categories of things. And they felt that Freud just kind of oversimplified and kind of made us almost either always sexually driven or driven by anger. And then they looked at Watson and behaviorism, and they didn't like Watson either because they said, I'm not a dog, so you can't take what you would say about a rat or a dog or a pigeon and apply it to a human being. So anytime you look at the humanistic approach, look for anything that uses words like free will, free choice, people are naturally good. Literally, they looked for psychodynamic approach. Again, Freud, Jung, Adler, but again, the big word, unconscious. When you see unconscious, you know that you are talking about psychoanalytic or psychodynamic. When I'm reading a test question, if I get to the word unconscious, I'm about 95% certain that it's going. Evolutionary or sociobiological approach. Notice this is the 1980s, not the 1890s, even though it falls back on a lot of Darwinian theory. So for evolutionary, it has to apply to the entire human species. This is going to be something like survival of the fittest. So anytime you're looking at something that has to do with natural selection, reproductive success, so who would mate with who, what behaviors now exist. A really good example of that would be fear of the dark. Universally across the planet, human beings do not like the dark. It's not that we're all terrified of it or we all need nightlights, but we're not necessarily comfortable in it. We're not built for a dark environment. Those people who probably had a healthy fear early on in human history probably survived, and that healthy fear of the dark was probably passed on to their progeny, which would later become us. That would be an example of something that would be more towards the evolutionary type theory. Some of the subfields that we're looking at now, this has more to do with jobs. So these aren't perspectives, but these are more areas of work. Clinical psychology is going to be those people who work often in mental hospitals and treat people with severe problems. If you want to be a clinical psychologist, you have to be working towards a PhD. So they will be able to evaluate, diagnose, and treat different psychological disorders. What they cannot do is they cannot write prescriptions. That's where you start to get into the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist. A psychologist can diagnose, a psychologist can provide therapy and other treatments. A psychiatrist can prescribe medication. A psychiatrist is someone who is both a licensed medical doctor and a clinical psychologist. Counseling psychology is going to be just a step below clinical, and this is going to be psychologists who are usually going to work with people who are dealing with less extreme disorders. So anxiety, lower levels of depression, maybe some phobias, you may be going to a counseling psychologist. They're also going to sometimes specialize, and you may have someone who specializes in family, marital, or career counseling. And in that, they're going to streamline how they provide their therapy. But again, they're going to interview, they're going to assess or test, and then they're going to provide therapy based off of what it is that they're dealing with. School psychology. These are going to be the people who will test kids in school. Now, when I say test, I'm talking about like the Iowas or any of those kind of standardized tests that will somehow place you an exceptional. Just to kind of elaborate on that, they may come in and hand everybody a survey to find out what would motivate employees. Would it be a raise? Would it be a bonus? Would it be a better break room? How do you improve staff morale? How do you improve productivity? How do you restructure something? How do you build a building to get the best out of people? And again, the building around the mind, if you read that, really focuses on how you could bring someone in and have them work hand in hand with an architect to impact things like education or Alzheimer's disease. So they look at the human factor and they make recommendations for improvements in the environment to facilitate that, whether it's structurally or just in the organization of the environment. Forensic psychology. This is where I crush hopes and dreams. Forensic psychology is probably not what you think it is. It is not hopping on a plane and going and finding serial killers. Forensic psychology is literally the application of psychology to issues arising in the legal system. In other words, if you are a forensic psychologist, you will spend more time sitting through child custody hearings, competency trials, making risk assessments, or doing what we would consider an involuntary commitment proceeding. You're going to sit there and try to decide which parent the child should be placed with for the health of the child, the mental health. You're going to see whether or not someone is going to be considered competent to stand trial, and the insanity plea is used less than 1% of the time, so don't expect a whole lot of those. You're going to look at violence and risk assessments. This is going to be for people who are going to go on parole. And you may have to determine whether or not someone is a danger to themselves, others, or may want to kill themselves. And in that case, you may be the person that will put them in a mental hospital against their will. That's what forensic psychology is. Now, yes, there is the behavioral analysis unit. That is a real thing in the FBI, but So these jobs only exist in Hollywood. If we go from left to right, the first person here, he's supposed to have photographic memory. They completely misuse photographic memory. He is not eidetic. You go to the third, the woman in the bright blue, she's a criminal. You cannot hack systems, and half the systems that she hacks into don't even exist. I've watched the show and I will literally laugh at the fun little system that she has figured out. Pick any of the others. You cannot look at something and determine whether or not they have mother issues, or if we're looking at where the focus of professional practice happens, notice that most of it is in the clinical area. It is then going to be followed up with counseling. So, I mean, of this pie, over about 80% of it is all going to deal with either clinical or counseling issues. Next becomes IO, and that is one of the largest and quickest kind of building areas of psychology. Then school systems, and then everything else is really small. Neuropsychology is on the grow also. Virginia Tech has opened one of the very first schools of neuroscience, or neuropsychology. So again, that's another developing career. And then you have forensics with that 0.5, and again, most of that is going to be the application to the legal system, not working for the FBI and chasing down serial. Some of the subfields: experimental psychology. Usually in the universities, most of your college professors are going to be there because they are running experiments, and they teach because that is last couple of subfields. Developmental psychology looks at human development from prenatal to death. And again, most of this is going to be now devoted to the elderly because we have such a large elderly population. Baby boomers are now getting into their 60s, their 70s, and their 80s. And with that, we have a large group of very active people who might live to their hundreds. And it is important to deal with things like depression, how they feel tied into the rest of the world, how to keep them mentally engaged, Alzheimer's disease, a whole host of other things. Psychometric psychology. Last slide. Colleges and universities and private practice are going to make the bulk of where people get employed, and then also hospitals and clinics. Notice that colleges and universities are usually going to have the people that are working in basic psychology. They're going to build the basis for what we know, experimentation, those sort of things. Private practice, hospitals and clinics, that's going to comprise most of your either clinical psychologist and your psychiatrist, and then also your counseling psychologist. And then business and government, elementary and secondary schools, other, you have that last small chunk that goes into more of those specialties.